There are things in this world that people pass over without a second glance. A rusted gate, a cracked window, a locked door on a building nobody visits anymore. We have found time and again that the things others walk away from are often the very things that change a life. This is one of those stories. Hazel Drummond was 22 years old the morning. Her stepfather, Gerald Mott, set her single trunk on the front porch of the house in Millhaven, Ontario, and told her she had until noon to collect it. She had expected it. Not that morning, not in quite that way. She had not expected the way he said it without looking at her, the way he kept his eyes fixed somewhere above her left shoulder as though he were speaking to the air itself. But she had expected it in the way you expect a cold snap in late October. You know it is coming. You simply hope you are better prepared when it arrives. She was not. Her mother had died 14 months earlier, in February, when the ice was still thick on the bay. Gerald Mott had been her mother's second husband, a quiet man with a ledger-keeper's mind, the kind of man who tracked every expense in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. He had never been unkind to Hazel, not openly. He had simply never quite included her in his accounting of the household. When her mother was alive, that had been tolerable. With her mother gone, it became something else entirely. "There's no provision," he said, that last morning, meaning there was no money set aside for her, no arrangement, no plan. He said it the way a man says the well has gone dry, as though it were simply a fact of nature, nothing to apologize for. Hazel picked up her trunk. She did not cry in front of him. What she had, when she walked away from that porch, was the following: $11.40 sewn into the lining of her coat, a change of clothes, a small tin of shortbread she had baked the day before without knowing why. Perhaps some part of her had known, and a leather satchel containing the tools of her trade. Wood-burning tools, carving knives, a set of small chisels, and the handle of a marking awl worn smooth from years of use. That awl had belonged to Elspeth Carey, the woodover, who had taken Hazel on as an apprentice at 15, and taught her everything worth knowing about patience, about grain, about the way a piece of wood will tell you what it wants to be if you are quiet enough to listen. Elspeth Carey had died 2 winters ago, and she had left Hazel those tools and the awl, and not much else. But those things were enough. They were the kind of enough that does not show on paper. Hazel took the train west from Millhaven, not because she had a destination, but because the ticket was cheaper in that direction, and she needed her $11 to last. She sat with her satchel on her lap and watched the Ontario countryside open up around her, the farms giving way to bush and rock, and the wide indifference of the Canadian Shield. She was not, she told herself, afraid. She was something else. Something that did not have a clean name yet. She got off the train at a town called Harwick 3 hours later, because the name on the station sign looked like something her mother might have liked, and because she had eaten the last of the shortbread and needed to find her bearings. Harwick, in those days, was the kind of town that had seen better decades. It sat at the edge of an old logging territory, a place that had boomed when the timber was plentiful and gone quiet when it was not. There was a main street with a hardware store, and a dry goods merchant and a church with a listing steeple. And at the far end of the street, past the livery that had converted itself into a motor garage, there was a municipal hall with a notice board on its front door. Hazel stood before that board for a long time, reading the papers pinned to it, which advertised rooms for let and church socials, and a public auction to be held that Saturday. The auction notice was brief. The estate of one Reuben Calloway, deceased, was to be liquidated. Tools, furnishings, the contents of the workshop, and this was the line that made Hazel stop. One locked storage cabinet, contents unknown, sold as is. She did not know why she kept coming back to that line. A locked cabinet was not a practical purchase for a woman with $11 and no fixed address. She knew that. She folded the notice anyway and put it in her coat pocket. She spent 2 nights in a rooming house run by a woman named Mrs. Pinch, who charged 30 cents a night and asked no questions, which was precisely what Hazel needed. On Saturday morning, she walked to the auction. It was held in the yard behind Reuben Calloway's workshop, which sat on a side street off the main road, hemmed in by 2 old maples. A small crowd had gathered, men mostly, farmers and tradespeople, a few women from the church auxiliary who had come for the furniture. An auctioneer in a canvas coat moved through the lots with practiced efficiency, and Hazel stood at the edge of the crowd with her hands in her pockets and watched. The storage cabinet came up near the end. It was a large thing, built from pine and ironwood, about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, with a heavy iron lock on the double doors. Someone in the crowd had tried the lock earlier and declared it seized solid. The cabinet had been moved from inside the workshop to the yard. And it sat there in the late September light looking stubborn and impenetrable and, to Hazel's eye, beautifully made. She's locked up tight, the auctioneer said. Contents unknown. Could be full of treasure, could be full of sawdust. A few people in the crowd laughed. Do we have $5 to open the bidding? Silence. 4, more silence. Someone at the back coughed. $3 then. $3 for a mystery. A man near the front shook his head and turned away. Hazel raised her hand. 2, she said. She did not entirely know why. She knew only that the cabinet was built by someone who knew what they were doing. The joinery at the corners was tight, the ironwork was heavy and deliberate, and that Reuben Calloway, whoever he had been, had locked it for a reason. People did not build something that well and then fill it with nothing. The auctioneer looked at her. No one else bid. Sold, he said. $2. She paid from the lining of her coat. She had $9.40 left. Getting the cabinet open took the better part of 2 days. The lock was not simply old. It had been deliberately secured with a second mechanism on the inside, a sliding bar she could hear but not reach. Hazel did not own a pry bar, and she was not prepared to damage the cabinet to get into it. Instead, she spent an afternoon studying the hinges, which were surface-mounted, and gap at the base of the door, and the way the light came through at the top when she tilted the whole thing slightly forward. She thought about what Elspeth Carey would have said. The piece will show you, if you look long enough. She looked. On the second morning, using a narrow chisel from her kit and a length of stiff wire she found in the yard, she worked the interior bar free from the outside through the lower hinge gap. It took 2 hours and cost her a small cut on her index finger and a great deal of patience. When the doors finally swung open, she stood back and looked at what was inside for a long, quiet moment before she touched anything. There were shelves, and on those shelves, organized with the precision of a man who had cared deeply about his work, were the following things. A complete set of carving tools, finer than anything Hazel had ever owned, wrapped in oilcloth. Several blocks of premium hardwood, walnut, cherry, a piece of bird's-eye maple. And at the back, on the lowest shelf, a flat wooden box, locked with a smaller latch, which when she opened it contained 2 things, a leather-bound ledger and a folded letter on top of it addressed, in careful handwriting, to whoever opens this cabinet. We want you to sit with that for a moment. Imagine standing in a yard in a town you arrived in by accident, with $9 to your name and a $2 cabinet you bought on instinct, and finding a letter addressed to you. Not by name, but by the simple fact of your persistence. Hazel sat down on an overturned crate and opened the letter. It was written by Reuben Calloway himself, dated 3 years earlier, in a hand that had grown shaky toward the end of the page, but remained legible throughout. He had been, she would learn, a master woodworker. The man who had built half the pews in the Harwick church, the counters in the dry goods store, the display cases in the old hotel before it closed. He had also been, for the last 6 years of his life, the holder of a secret that had troubled him deeply, and that he had not, for reasons of his own, known how to bring into the open. The ledger was the secret. It contained, in Reuben Calloway's careful hand, a complete record of transaction conducted over a period of 11 years, by a man named Douglas Hewitt, who had served as the treasurer of the Harwick Tradespeople's Cooperative, a small fund to which local craftspeople and laborers had contributed a portion of their earnings each month, meant to provide support in cases of illness or accident or sudden hardship. The fund had been established in 1901 and had, by Reuben's accounting, accumulated nearly $800 by 1909, when Douglas Hewitt had quietly closed the cooperative's account at the bank, transferred the funds to a personal account under a variation of his own name, and told the cooperative's members that the fund had been dissolved due to insufficient contributions. 11 families had lost their contributions. Several of those families had, in the years following, faced exactly the kind of hardship the fund was meant to address. A carpenter with a broken arm, a millwright's widow, with 4 children and no income, a stonemason who lost 2 fingers in an accident and could no longer work at full capacity. They had come to the cooperative's account and found it empty. Douglas Hewitt had expressed sympathy and moved on. He had, by the time Reuben Calloway locked that cabinet, retired comfortably to a house on the better end of town. Reuben had discovered the truth by accident. A slip of paper that fell out of an old ledger Hewitt had carelessly left behind in the workshop during a renovation, and had spent 3 years trying to decide what to do about it. He was old by then, and not well, and he had been afraid in the way that old men who have lived quietly and caused no trouble are sometimes afraid of causing trouble, even righteous trouble, even when the trouble needs causing. He had written in his letter that he was sorry he had not been braver, that whoever found the cabinet would know what to do in a way that he had not. I leave you the tools because they are good tools, and they deserve to be used. I leave you the ledger because it deserves to be seen. I leave you the decision because it is not mine to make anymore. Hazel read the letter twice. Then she opened the ledger and read it from the beginning. She was not a lawyer. She was not a politician or a newspaper editor or a woman of influence in Harwick or anywhere else. She was 22 years old, with $9.40 and a cabinet full of woodworking tools in a town where she knew no one. She was also, as it happened, the daughter of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being told she was not in a position to say anything about anything, and she had watched what that kind of silence cost a person over time. She was not going to be quiet, but she was going to be careful. She spent a week in Harwick before she made any move at all. She found work almost immediately. Mrs. Pinch at the rooming house needed a new mantel for her sitting room fireplace, and when she saw what Hazel could do with a piece of walnut and Reuben Calloway's best carving tools, she told 2 neighbors, and by the end of the week Hazel had 3 commissions, and a small but growing reputation as the young woman who had bought Reuben Calloway's cabinet and could carve anything you put in front of her. She listened while she worked. She asked questions in the easy, unhurried way of someone who is simply making conversation. She learned that Douglas Hewitt still lived in Harwick, that he was in his 70s now, and not often seen in public. She learned the names of the families who had contributed to the cooperative, many of them still in town, some of them the children and grandchildren of the original members. She learned that the dry goods merchant, a man named Patrick Gould, had been the cooperative secretary in its last years, and still felt, she was told, a private guilt about the dissolution, though he had not known at the time that anything was wrong. She went to see Patrick Gould on a Tuesday afternoon, with the ledger under her arm. We will not pretend that it was a simple conversation. Patrick Gould was a careful man, and he needed time. He sat with the ledger for a long while and did not say anything, and then he said several things in a low, tight voice that are not worth repeating here. Then he asked Hazel how she had come by it, and she told him, and he was quiet again. Hewitt will deny everything, he said eventually. He might, Hazel said, but the ledger is in his handwriting. The bank records can be requested, and there are 11 families in this town who are owed an accounting. It took 3 months. Patrick Gould, to his considerable credit, did not flinch from what needed to be done. He contacted a solicitor in Kingston. He gathered the former cooperative members, those still living, and their families. He presented the ledger. The bank records, when obtained, confirmed every line of Reuben Calloway's accounting. Douglas Hewitt did not go to prison. He was old and in poor health, and the events in question were more than a decade past. But he was compelled, by legal agreement and by the weight of public knowledge in a town where everyone knew everyone, to liquidate a portion of his estate and return what was owed, principal plus interest, calculated over 11 years. The families received their contributions back. The millwright's widow, who was still alive, received hers with a note she reportedly read 3 times before folding it and putting it in her apron pocket. Hazel was not in the room for most of this. She had handed the ledger to Patrick Gould and stepped back, because it was not her ledger to wave around. It had been Reuben Calloway's courage, belatedly given. It had been 11 families' loss, and it was 11 families' restitution. She was simply the person who had been stubborn enough to open a locked cabinet. What she received, in the end, was a workshop. Patrick Gould and 3 of the cooperative's former members, in a gesture that was practically Canadian in its understatement. No ceremony, no speeches, just a key left on her workbench one morning with a note, arranged the lease on the old workshop space at a nominal rate for 2 years. The workshop where Reuben Calloway had built half the furniture in Harwick, where she had opened the cabinet, where she had read, letter addressed to whoever had the patience to find it. She moved in on a Thursday in December. She set Elspeth Carey's marking all on the shelf above the workbench, next to Reuben Calloway's best draw knife. And she stood for a moment in the middle of the room, which smelled of old pine shavings and linseed oil, and the particular cold of a Canadian winter morning, and thought about the 2 women and one old man who had, in their different ways, brought her to this place. The first piece she made in that workshop was a small panel, cherry wood from Reuben's own stock, carved with a simple image, a closed door with light coming through the gap at the bottom. She did not sell it. She hung it on the wall. By the following spring, she had more work than she could manage alone. By the summer, she had taken on an apprentice, a 14-year-old from one of the cooperative families, A girl with good hands and a great deal of patience, which is, as Elspeth Carey had always said, the only thing that truly cannot be taught. Harwick did not change overnight. Towns do not. But it changed in the small, specific ways that are the only changes that last. A workshop that had sat empty for 3 years came back to life. A set of family names that had been quietly resentful found a reason to stop being so. An old man's courage, given too late, and then not too late after all, turned out to matter. Reuben Calloway's cabinet still stands in that workshop. We are told it is used now to store patterns and templates, and the good tools that are not for everyday use. The lock, Hazel had a local blacksmith repair, and the key hangs on a hook beside it. Not because the cabinet needs to be locked anymore, but because Reuben Calloway built that lock well, and it seemed a shame not to keep it working. The best $2 she ever spent, some people in Harwick say. Hazel, when someone says this to her, tends to smile and say she's not sure Reuben Calloway would agree it was a bargain. The ledger was always meant to be found. She just happened to be the one looking. We think she is probably right about that, and so we leave you with this, because we always like to ask before we go. Have you ever looked past something that everyone else had written off? A place, a person, an old locked thing sitting in a yard, and found something worth opening? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.